Welcome to the Yates Community Forum. I'm your host, Host-Devell Blanton. Our guest today is a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, a combat veteran who has flown over 100 missions during the Vietnam War. He has served as a test pilot, logging more than 7,000 hours of flying time in more than 30 models of aircraft. He was selected by NASA in 1980 to be an astronaut, where he went on to fly 4 missions into space. In January of 2003, he retired from the United States Marine Corps after 34 years of service with the rank of Major General. Please welcome war hero, test pilot, astronaut, Major General Charles Bolden, Jr. How you doing today, sir?
Doing very well. Thank you very much for inviting me up. It's good to be here.
You ready for our first question?
I'm ready for the first question.
All right, let's get started. I understand that your hobbies include playing soccer, golf, as well as reading. So how's your golf game, and what do you like to read?
My golf game is lousy. I'm a worse soccer player, but I just like being outdoors. And I don't read as much as I should, but recently I've taken to reading books that have more to do with politics and the like. My most recent favorite book is called Bush at War, that was written by Bob Woodford, who was one of the persons that authored the book that exposed the Nixon administration back during the Watergate days.
All right. So what is your reaction to the recent report about the Columbia accident?
I actually, having had an opportunity to spend 14 years in the space program, a lot of what came out in the Columbia Accident Investigation Board was not surprising to me. When people talk about the culture, the way they do in the report, I'm not sure I buy that particular part, but it is just a way that NASA does their work. I think the report is very accurate for the most part. It's very to the point. I think it's very hard-hitting, and so I think if we follow along with the recommendations from the report, we'll be able to return to space flight safely in a relatively short period of time.
All right. Do you think the failure is not an option model of the 60s still exists at NASA today?
Oh, the failure is not an option model, and for those in your audience who may not know, the term failure is not an option was coined by Gene Kranz, who was one of the flight directors during the Apollo era. When Apollo 13 had the side of the spacecraft blown out, everybody on the ground felt that there was no way we were going to get the crew back. Even the crew on board had come to the realization that they were not going to get back to Earth. They were going to die in space. But Gene Kranz called the team together and let them know that failure was not an option in this particular case. That's what got us to the moon. That's what got us to, when I say us, I still use the term us, although I'm not formally in the NASA family anymore. But that's what enabled us to recover from the Challenger accident. It's that yeah, we made a mistake. We've had a failure along the way, but it won't take the program down. And I'm confident that the NASA family will rise to the occasion. Again, this particular failure will not take the program down.
I understand you flew over 100 combat missions in Vietnam. Tell us the purposes of your missions and experiences that you went through in Vietnam.
I was what in the Marine Corps we called an attack pilot. I flew the A-6 Intruder. It was a 2-seat, side-by-side jet aircraft. It was not supersonic. It was a subsonic jet aircraft. In its day, it was probably the best aircraft in the U.S. inventory. It could carry more than its weight in bombs. It carried up to 28 500-pound bombs. Very accurate, all-weather delivery, so we didn't need to see the ground. We had a radar on board, forward-looking infrared eventually, and we could actually fly above the clouds, pick out targets, and then prosecute the targets. Most of my time in Vietnam, I was flying out of a country called Thailand and out of a base that was in a place in the Thai jungle called Nam Pang, south of Vientiane, Laos. We would make most of our flights at night, so we did usually one plane, what we call armed interdiction. We would go into North Vietnam from any of a number of different directions. And our primary focus back then was to try to intercept the flow of weapons coming from North Vietnam into South Vietnam to arm the Viet Cong and those who were trying to overthrow the South Vietnamese government. As history tells, we did okay, but we were unsuccessful because we did not stop the flow of arms to the south. We did not stop the onslaught of the North Vietnamese. And eventually the war was ended with us kind of saying, okay, let's call it over, and the North Vietnamese took over the country. And today, it's a united country called Vietnam, but still has some of the scars that are left over from the 1970s when I was there, 60s and 70s.
All right. Since you flew combat in Vietnam, which was a controversial war, What are your thoughts and opinions about the U.S. war in Iraq?
Any war is a controversial war, first of all. If you happen to be a scholar of the Bible or you happen to be somebody who's very religious, you probably feel that there is really never a need to go to war. I'm sort of in the middle. I served for 35 years in the Marine Corps because I wanted to be able to ensure the American public that we had the strength and the resolve to resist going to war. And generally it works. It's called deterrence. Okay. If you have a very strong military, then most other countries would rather go to the bargaining table and talk rather than fight. Vietnam was very controversial because not much unlike today, there were questions about why the government was taking us, the leadership in the government was taking us into that war. Over time, it grew and grew and grew until it finally ended with not the outcome that we wanted. The war in Iraq is not unlike that. We've been at Saddam Hussein for more than 12 years, actually for decades. It was felt by the present administration that we needed to go in and change the way the government was run, change the way the country was run. I'm not sure which side I come down on, although I don't think we gave it quite enough time at the bargaining table. I don't think we utilized diplomacy as much as we should have to avoid having to go to war. I'll say one thing, though, to your listening audience. Once you make the commitment to go to war, unfortunately, the country has made that commitment, and right or wrong, and there's somebody that some of your history students can tell me who said it, but my country, right or wrong, but my country. And that really is the way that we all have to feel. Whether we were right or wrong in starting the war in Iraq, we're now there. And we owe it to the American servicemen and women who fought there, who continue to fight there, who died there, as well as to ourselves, to see it through to the end. So, very controversial getting into it. Right. For me, there is no controversy about whether you stay and finish the job that was started by young men and women, much like you and your classmates. You'll be in the same situation, not very far off from now. Okay.
Tell me about your experience as a test pilot. What does it mean to have the right stuff?
I don't know that I have the right stuff. I can tell you, the term right stuff comes from a book written by Tom Wolfe about the initial. It actually focused on the original 7 Mercury astronauts, but it also talked about some of the people who were good enough to have become astronauts, but either they were too old or they didn't have the education or a number of other reasons weren't selected by NASA to become a group of the first 7 astronauts. And that's what Tom Wolfe refers to as people who had the physical ability, the mental toughness, the physical toughness, the educational background to be the right people for the time. So that's what he refers to as the right stuff. There are thousands of people, in my estimation, who have the right stuff to be astronauts. Astronauts are not superhuman beings. I used to believe that astronauts were superhuman beings. The reason I didn't apply for the space shuttle program the first time NASA advertised was because I thought I was not qualified to be there. I was not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. I was not 5 feet 10 inches tall. And at the time, I was not a test pilot. Once I became a test pilot, however, and had an opportunity to meet some of the people who, at that time, were not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, nor male, nor 5 feet 10 inches tall. One of my favorite being my fraternity brother, the late Dr. Ron McNair, who actually went to church right here in this community while he was in the astronaut program. But I saw him, and I said, at least if he could do that, I can try it. And that's the message that I try to get out as I visit schools and other places, is that you may not think you can do something, but you owe it to yourself to try. In order to be able to be competitive, you've got to study, you've got to work hard, and you have to be not afraid of failing or not afraid of making mistakes.
All right. So just tell us, what is your favorite aircraft to fly and why?
Oh, gee. My favorite aircraft, without doubt, was the A-6 Intruder. It was my first operational aircraft. It's no longer in the U.S. inventory, however, but that is my all-time favorite to fly. My second most favorite airplane is actually a helicopter. It's the CH-46. We call it the Sea Knight. It's probably the oldest aircraft in the U.S. inventory right now, next to a B-52. It's actually a 2-seat helicopter. It's a medium transport helicopter. The pilots sit side by side, much as the same in the A-6. It has a crew chief, and usually a flight engineer or somebody else who helps in the back, because it can carry up to 16 people. So it carries people and cargo. It's a very fun aircraft to fly. Doesn't have all the whiz-bang things that modern aircraft have, but that's my second favorite, and then the F-18 Hornet. So in that order.
So what was your reaction when NASA nominated you to be an astronaut in 1980?
I was shocked.
Were you really?
I was startled. At the time, I was a test pilot. I was stationed at the Naval Air Test Center in Patuxent River, Maryland, and I was enjoying myself immensely. I was flying a lot. I was flying the A6 family of aircraft, which meant the A6, the EA-6B, which was a 4-seat aircraft, flying the A7 family of aircraft, as well as I just started flying an A3, which was a big, old, ugly airplane. I had gone and applied for the program, had been interviewed by NASA here in Houston, and then months had passed. And I had come back from my interview and told my wife that it was thrilling to have been honored to interview, but there was no way in the world I was going to be selected, just based on the quality of the people with whom I had interviewed in the week I was here. And it was on her birthday, May 31st, 1980, that the phone rang as I was on my way walking out to go fly a test flight and talked to a gentleman from the Johnson Space Center who said, "You still want to be an astronaut?" I told him, "Sure." I thought it was a joke, but I said, "Sure." And he said, "How soon can you be here?" I said, "I can be there tomorrow if you need me." And he told me, "Well, don't need you quite that quickly, but if you can be here the 1st of January, you've been selected among the 19 people that we're going to bring in the second group of Space Shuttle astronauts." So, but I was startled. I felt I was truly blessed and excited, and the excitement has not ended yet, even though I haven't been in the space program for almost 10 years.
All right. You flew the shuttle Discovery in 1990 with the crew that deployed the Hubble telescope. Tell me about that flight.
The Hubble Space Telescope mission, STS, its call sign was STS-31, and it was actually my second flight into space. I had flown the first time on Columbia in January of 1986, and then 10 days after coming back, we lost Challenger and her crew. But after the 2 years plus that it took us to get back to flight, I flew my second flight aboard Discovery. It was exciting because we knew we had a 5-member crew, and we knew long before we launched that it would be of historical significance, significant to the scientific community, and it would make a difference in the world, and I still believe that thoroughly. But the hard part about the Hubble Space Telescope deploy mission was getting to orbit. We were, ideally, the astronomers wanted to have it be in something that we call geosynchronous orbit, which is 23,000 miles above Earth. We don't have a way to get a manned spacecraft to that altitude yet. So the highest we figured we could go was about 600 kilometers or 400 miles above Earth. But it meant that we were going to take half of our fuel to get there, and then we'd have half left to get back to Earth. And if something went wrong, we wouldn't get back. But we understood that. So the hard part was getting it to its 400 nautical mile orbit. The flight up went uneventfully. We didn't have any problem getting into orbit. But on the very day that we were to deploy the space telescope, things started going wrong. We could not get one of the 2 solar arrays to deploy properly the first day. So what was supposed to have taken us an hour ended up taking us about a day. We actually had 2 of my crew members, Dr. Kathy Sullivan, who was America's first woman to walk in space, and Bruce McCandless, who was the first human to become a satellite when he flew a nitrogen-powered gas backpack and flew away from the shuttle about the distance of a football field and turned around and came back. But I put them in what we call an airlock and got them ready to go out and manually try to get the telescope to work. Before we were able to put them out, we discovered that the problem was really a software problem, wasn't hardware at all. And all of you can understand that a lot better than I can because you work with computers all the time. But simply by changing the signal that went from the ground up to the satellite, to the space telescope, we were able to get the solar array to deploy. We put it out. Several weeks later, it was discovered that it had a vision problem, much the same as I do. It needed glasses because its mirror, while perfectly ground, was not exactly to the specifications it should be out on the outer edge, so it didn't focus everything the way it should. A couple of years later, we sent a crew back up, revisited the telescope, put in a package of instruments about the size of a telephone booth that contained essentially corrective lenses and mirrors and stuff. And now Hubble works even better than it was ever designed to work. We've actually had 3 revisits to Hubble to upgrade upgrade its instruments aboard. And now the big discussion among NASA and the astronomical community is whether or not we're going to leave Hubble to do some more work for many more years, or whether we're going to just deorbit it, bring it back to Earth and let it be destroyed, or bring it back in a space shuttle. But it's scheduled now to be replaced by something called the James Webb telescope.
Okay. Tell me about your 1992 flight where you were the commander of Atlantis in the Space Laboratory mission.
My 1992 flight aboard Atlantis was actually my third flight, but it was the first time that I was in charge of the crew and the mission. You asked about aviators before. Among astronauts, we have pilots, mission specialists, who I think are the smartest people, and then payload specialists, who are non-career astronauts, but they're also very smart. And they fly depending on what kind of experiments you're doing. On Atlas, which was the call sign for our flight, it was STS-45. My crew, we had a 7-member crew, and we worked in 2 shifts. We had a day crew, red crew, and a blue crew. So one crew worked for about 14 hours and went to bed, and the other crew worked for about 14 hours and went to bed with some overlap between the two. Our primary mission was to study our Earth's atmosphere to help us understand a lot more about what scientists call the middle atmosphere or the mesosphere, an area that's very close to Earth, but we don't understand a lot about. So we were up with 13 different scientific experiments on board. 3 of them looked at the sun and did solar measurements, but the other 10 were from all around the world, and they actually peered into our atmosphere and helped us gain information about what it is that makes up our atmosphere, how the gases interact, how the different layers of the atmosphere interact with each other, and it was a very successful mission. Gave me an opportunity to actually test my mettle in terms of leading an international crew of people on a $2 billion spacecraft for a 9-day mission that had a lot of work to do, and it worked out very well.
All right. Tell me about your 4th mission to space where you flew with the Russian cosmonaut.
My 4th flight, which was aboard Discovery, again, it was my 2nd flight aboard Discovery. We flew in 1994, and it was the first joint Russian-American space shuttle mission. So it was the first time that the United States and the Russian space programs had been together since 1975 when we flew the Apollo-Soyuz test project, uniting an Apollo spacecraft with a Russian Soyuz spacecraft on orbit. This time I actually had 2 Russian cosmonauts, 2 veteran Russian cosmonauts who trained with us. One of them, Sergei Konstantinovich Krikalev, actually ended up being a mission specialist on my crew. And again, we worked mostly joint Russian and American medical experiments. We were on orbit for 8 days. It was the precursor for the subsequent shuttle Mir missions, where we flew the American space shuttle up to the Russian space station Mir and docked, and now to the International Space Station, where we fly the shuttle up to the International Space Station and dock and do work. So we were the very first flight in what is now the International Space Station series.
Okay. In 1997, you served as a Deputy Commander General, Marines Forces, Pacific. What did your job entail then?
My job was, in 1997, my primary job was actually Assistant Wing Commander for, I take that back, I was actually the Deputy Commander for the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force out of Camp Pendleton, California. That organization is the primary warfighting organization in the Marine Corps. We have what we call 3 Marine Expeditionary Forces, or MEFs. 1 MEF is in California, 2 MEF is in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, 3 MEF headquartered in Okinawa. When we were having trouble with Iraq and Saddam Hussein back then, it was decided by the President of the United States and the National Command Authority that we were going to send forces to Kuwait to prepare for the potential to go into Iraq. And I went over leading the 1st contingent of Marines stationed just south of the Iraqi border, and my job was to organize U.S. Marine forces that would support, back then, it was General Tommy Franks, who ended up being the commander of our unified forces in U.S. Central Command, but at the time he was the commander of 3rd Army. So I worked for him in supporting General Zinni with U.S. Central Command in preparation for the war in Iraq that we did not prosecute at that time. We ended up making a few strikes with Tomahawk missiles and the like, but we did not send any ground forces in then.
All right. What do you see as a long-term mission of the space station?
Space station is a very interesting piece of hardware. It's huge, for one thing. You have to go all the way back to the 1970s, the early 1970s, when President Nixon was President of the United States. NASA pitched to him something that was called a concept called the Space Transportation System. Right. And it consisted of an International Space Station, a space shuttle, a vehicle that could go from Earth to the space station. And then the third part of it was going to be an orbital transfer vehicle, or an orbital maneuvering vehicle that we could use to go from one space station to another, or eventually from the space station to other planets. So that's the way it started out. Shortly after Nixon said that we could do that, NASA was informed that there wasn't enough money to do it all, so take your pick. And we chose the space shuttle initially, but still kept working toward the space station. In its original design, the International Space Station was to be a waypoint, a stopping off point, if you will, for going into further planetary exploration. We were going to go from the space station back to the lunar surface. We were going to go from the space station to Mars, from the space station to other planets that we may want to explore. I think that eventually we will end up doing that. We will put other space stations up, but for right now, we've got to get the shuttle back in the air and then develop a follow-on vehicle to the shuttle. But the space station right now we use as a spaceborne laboratory, a place where we can send people for long periods of time. Right now it's usually 4 to 6 months, and they work in the weightless environment of space and do experiments that benefit us down here on Earth, but could not be done if we were here on Earth, in the length of time, the short period of time that we can do them in space.
All right. When do you think NASA will attempt a mission to Mars, and how difficult do you really think it's going to be?
Great question. I don't know when NASA will attempt to go to Mars. I think we will. Human spaceflight to Mars, because we've already gone to Mars a number of times with robotic spacecraft. And right now, even as we speak, there are 2 spacecraft that are en route to Mars to arrive sometime around Christmas. They will hopefully land on the Martian surface and be as successful as the Mars rover was some years ago. They will explore the planet in 2 different areas. They will gather data about its atmosphere, about the surface, and help us understand whether or not we think humans can survive on the Martian surface. The other hard thing is that determines when we go is, can humans survive the trip from here to Mars? Because once you leave what we call low Earth orbit and you get out where you don't have Earth's magnetic shield, something called the magnetosphere, that keeps cosmic rays and other particles from bombarding Earth and killing all of us every day. Once you get outside that magnetic shield, potentially you're exposed to catastrophic radiation. We think we can get people from here to there without being exposed to the levels of radiation that would be hazardous to health. We just need to get more and more test data by flying robotic vehicles first, and then we'll go. My guess, and it's really a guess, is it will go to the lunar surface sometime in the next 10 years. Somebody sitting in this studio will be among that crew, if we're lucky. At least one person here will decide that they're not afraid of taking the challenge of becoming an astronaut and going to the surface of the moon.
All right. What advice would you give young people such as myself to be successful like you?
I would say you don't necessarily have to pick me as a person to be successful like. Pick your teachers. Pick your moms and dads. Pick anybody in the community that you see making a contribution to the community. And if you want to be like them, that's the way I became a Marine. That's the way I got to where I am now. I kept seeing people who reminded me of my mom and dad, and I kept saying, I want to be like them. So that's the first thing I'd say. Pick somebody that you can identify with and say, I want to be like them. And then study your little backsides off. Right. You've got to study. I know you don't want to hear that, but in order to succeed in any walk of life, whether it's as an athlete or an astronaut, you've really got to study and put something between your ears other than gray matter. The second thing is you've really got to work hard. You've got to be intense about what it is that interests you. If I go back and I compare a professional athlete to an astronaut, the only difference is the field of play. The professional athlete plays every week on surface, on grass or on a tennis court or on something else. Astronauts play in the weightless environment of space. Their work is both serious. Their work both requires a lot of study, a lot of practice, and if you're going to be good, you've got to work real hard at either one. And the third, and perhaps the most important thing, if I go back to the failure is not an option thing, failure is not an option, but failure is a fact of life.
True.
And although we may say that we will not accept failure, the successful person is willing to try and extend themselves beyond their own personal limits, beyond where they know they can go, and run the risk of failure. I think failure is good for a human being because at least it gives you the satisfaction of knowing that you went a little bit beyond where you thought you could. The person who's successful tries something, fails at it, tries it again, fails at it, and tries it over and over and over, is persistent until they're successful in that. You will find this throughout your life. You probably already found it, as a matter of fact, or you wouldn't be sitting here in the capacity you're doing. So those are the three things I would say. Study very hard, work intensely at what you do, and don't be afraid of failing. Don't be afraid of being a risk taker, but take smart risks.
All right. So what are your future plans now?
Boy, I'm presently happily employed with a local company, a small woman-owned business down in the Clear Lake area that's called Tech Trans International. We have about 140 employees, 80 of them here in the Houston area, 60 of them over in Moscow, Russia. We do mostly interpretation and translation, translation being taking the written word from one language to another, interpretation meaning taking the spoken word from one language to another. We provide logistics support for companies like NASA, like some of the nuclear energy labs, some of the oil companies. We move them into and out of Russia. We teach foreign languages. We teach about 5 different foreign languages. And we have people who teach English as a second language to a lot of small companies around Houston. So if there are any of your viewing audience that think languages are their forte, I say again, study very hard. Go to a good school where you can continue to pursue that language, become an expert in it, and then come look for me at Tech Trans, because I'll probably be there a few years from now, give you a job as a translator or an interpreter.
All right, I'll keep that in mind.
All right.
Well, Mr. Bolden, I'd like to thank you for coming out and giving me this opportunity to have this interview.
Thank you very much. It's been thrilling.
All right. I'm Devell Blanton of the Yates Community Forum. Until next time.